Well, good evening. It's my pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm going to ask you to turn to Psalm chapter 34. We're going to get started there, and then we'll quickly move into 1 Samuel so we can talk about David a little bit tonight. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and appreciate the big crowd tonight. I have appreciated the first three classes that we've had. They've been wonderful, especially because of the discussion that comes from you. Just wonderful comments have been made, and a wonderful study that has blessed me, and I hope it has blessed you if you've been here as well. We've been talking about what it means to be a person after God's own heart, and how being a person after God's own heart means that your heart is like God's. It doesn't mean that you're chasing after Him. It means that just like it is said of the animals, just like it said of the trees in the book of Genesis, that your heart is according to its kind. Your heart is down from God's heart. So being a person after God's own heart means that your heart is like God's. And we've been talking about different facets of David's heart and how his heart was like God's. We talked about on Monday how he had a caring heart. He loved others the way God did. And we talked on Tuesday about how he had a tender heart. He was willing to repent and change, and that enabled God to mold him into the kind of instrument that he wanted. And this morning we talked about how David had a brave heart. He had a courageous heart. And we talked about how courage is a fundamental quality for a Christian, because if you don't have courage, then you can't guarantee that you're going to follow through with any of the other good qualities that a Christian needs. Sometimes you need courage to be kind. You need courage to love. You need courage to have self-control. And we talked about how David exhibited that. Tonight, I've been asked again to talk about courage in the life of David, but to talk about it in a different moment in his life. Not courage that he exhibits when he faces a giant, but courage that he faces when he is in distress. And I want to start, all my notes lit up just because that's so bright back there. I wasn't expecting that. I want to start in Psalm 34. I want you to notice what's said here by David. He says this, Psalm 34, verse 1, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul will make its boast in the Lord. The humble will hear it and rejoice. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together. I sought the Lord, and He answered me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked to Him and were radiant, and their faces will never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear Him and rescues them. O taste and see that the Lord is good. How blessed is the man who takes refuge in Him. Now that last line is one of my favorite phrases in the Bible. The idea of tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. I like that idea because tasting is something that you can only experience yourself, right? And so if you and I were going to go get a piece of cheesecake at the Cheesecake Factory and we decided, for whatever reason, we were going to split a piece of cheesecake, how would you feel if I grabbed the plate and slid it over to my side and took your fork from you and said, look, I'm going to eat this whole cheesecake. I'm not going to let you have any, but don't worry, I'll tell you how it tastes. Are you okay with that? Yes, no, maybe so. You're not okay with that, right? Why? It's not good enough to hear from me how it tastes. The only way to truly understand how good it is to take a bite for yourself. That's what David is challenging us to do in Psalm 34. He says, I have tried trusting the Lord. I have tried to live a faithful life to Him. And guess what? I found that He's good. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear Him. And he says, I challenge you to try tasting it for yourself. I can only tell you so much. You're only going to see just how good the Lord is when you take a bite for yourself. And so what we see in 1 Samuel, go ahead and turn there with me. In 1 Samuel 17, when David fights against Goliath, what we see is that he exhibits courage. He tries trusting God. And what does he find? He finds that the Lord is good. The Lord follows through. The Lord takes care of him. The Lord helps him slay a giant. And that's an amazing thing. But I want to ask you this evening, what happens when things don't get good right away? What happens when you try tasting to see if the Lord is good and things kind of go wrong? What happens when we choose to be brave and instead of standing victorious above a slain giant, I get knocked down? How do I trust God then? It seems to me that when it comes to courage, when it comes to bravery, there's another facet of the discussion that we have to talk about. You see, courage is necessary in moments of fear, in moments of trial. Courage is also necessary in moments of sorrow, in moments of grief, in moments of depression. It's necessary in moments of despair. And we see that David was a man after God's own heart, not only because he was courageous and stood up when he was scared, but we see David was a man after God's own heart because he was brave and courageous even when things didn't go the way he thought they should. Even when bad things happened to good people. That's what we see in the story of David. Now, I want you to notice this about David. I want you to notice that what happens after he slays Goliath is not what you would expect. All right, let's say you don't know how the Bible story goes. What are you expecting? You're a young, ruddy youth. You slay the giant that the king's not willing to kill. How do you think life's going to be after that? What do you think? Y'all are going to have to talk at some point. Now would be a great time. How would life go? Great, right? I'm expecting things are going to be good. People are going to think I'm awesome. And what about spiritually? Not just physically, but spiritually. I'm going to be blessed by God. I stood up to a giant. I was the one who took down the guy who taunted the armies of the living God. Right? And so God should bless me abundantly. This should go great. How do things go for David after Goliath, though? Have you ever thought about that? You ever thought about what happens in David's life after he slays Goliath? Let me show you a couple scenes in his life. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 through 13, this is what we read. It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Now it came about on the next day. Did you read that? When did this happen? The next day, that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house, while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as a commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And so if you're in David's shoes, you just returned home from slaying Goliath, everybody's singing your praises, and then the next day, the king tries to kill you with a spear twice. Is that how you thought things would go? It's not how I would think things would go. And if I'm in David's shoes in a moment like that, what am I thinking? What are you thinking? If you're in David's shoes, right after killing Goliath, and the king tries to put you to death with a spear, how do you feel? Scared? What else? Why confused? Yeah, that's exactly. You should be grateful for this. What's going on? Why am I being persecuted? I did nothing wrong. In fact, I did everything right. What do you feel? How do you feel? What thoughts are going through your head? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So betrayal, like, God, you were there for me with Goliath. Why aren't you here for me with Saul? Why are you letting the king try to kill me with a spear twice? So there are all kinds of questions. Things aren't going the way you think they would go. And you might be tempted to respond by saying, look, why am I being persecuted? Why are bad things happening to me when I've been so good? God, don't you appreciate what I just did? This is not the reward that I was expecting. You ever have moments like that in your life where you feel that way? God, why aren't you making this work out the way it's supposed to work out? Look at this a little bit later in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Look at how this story progresses, which is something you probably know. 1 Samuel 18, verse 30, it says, Then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so his name was highly esteemed. Now Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants, to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. And so Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now, therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I don't know about you, but I come to a moment like that, and it's a very similar moment for me. I may do something good and have something frustrating happen to me, and I say, you know what, that happens sometimes for a Christian. I'm just going to keep doing the right thing, and good's going to happen eventually. But then when the next bad thing happens, then you really start to get frustrated. Then you really start to wonder, why do I even try to be good? Why am I even trying to do the right thing? Why am I walking down this straight and narrow path? Like the people in Malachi, we might be tempted to say, it's useless to serve God. Because I'm doing the right things, that I'm being persecuted. And what's Saul doing? He's horrible. And yet, everything good is happening for him. God hasn't taken the kingdom from him yet. We have moments like that too, where we wonder, okay, I've endured a little bit. Why aren't things getting better yet? And then we have a story like this, 1 Samuel chapter 21, where the story of David continues. You know, we often say about the story of Job, that Job didn't get the benefit of reading the first 2 chapters, right? He doesn't know what's going on in the spiritual realm. He just starts getting assaulted from on high, and he has no idea what's going on. The same is true in the story of David. This is right after Goliath, and then bad thing after bad thing after bad thing after bad thing happens. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 10. Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing one of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? And so David gets to this point where he's in such straits that he goes to the Philistines. He goes to the enemy. And what's the enemy do with him? What's the enemy do with him? You don't know? Somebody's got to say something. I tolerate more awkwardness than you do, I promise. What do they do with David? They send him away. Not even the enemy will accept him. And so in that moment, you might be thinking to yourself, David has to act like a madman so that he can get out of their presence, with letting his saliva run down his beard. What a humbling thing that would have been for him. And if you're standing there in that moment, what are you thinking? God, how could you let me fall so far? How could you let this happen to me? Like, I understand putting a few obstacles in my life. I got that. You know, trials make people good. James writes about that. David probably didn't think that, but we think that, right? But not this. How could you let me fall this far? How could you let things get this bad? You ever have moments like that in your life? How could you let things get this bad for me, God, financially? How could you let me lose my job? God, I have been trying my best to be the husband or the wife that I ought to be. How could you let things get this bad in my marriage? Why can't things get worked out? How could I fall this far when I'm trying to do good? When I have been good? Then you have this story. This is the last one I'll reference. 1 Samuel chapter 24. This is a story I think we've referenced every single day of class if you've been here for the morning sessions. I apologize. But it is a great little story. This is in 1 Samuel 24 when David and his men are in the cave and Saul comes in to relieve himself. And it says, 1 Samuel 24, he came to the sheepfolds on the way, and now there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. And David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. And the men of David said to him, Behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. And it came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, Far be it from me because of the Lord, that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. And David persuaded his men with these words and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose, he left the cave, and went his way. And I don't know about you, but I've had moments like that too. Moments where I feel like I've hit the absolute pit, I've hit rock bottom, and in that moment I summon the last bit of strength I have and I say, God, I've been doing it right, I've been doing it good, and it hasn't turned out right, but surely in this moment, when you see this incredible good thing that I'm doing for you, you're finally going to turn things around for me. And so David, when he has the opportunity to end Saul's life, he lets him go. And maybe that's exactly what he was thinking. Now things will get better. Now things really will turn out the way that they're supposed to turn out. Is that what happens? Is that what happens? Somebody say no. Thank you. It's not what happens. We got chapters upon chapters upon chapters of more stuff that happens, don't we? And so you have the episode in chapter 25 with Nabal, where he does this really good thing by taking care of the shepherds and providing for them and protecting them. And Nabal's like, I'm not going to give you any food. Of course, he does pick up a wife from that, which Abigail was pretty great. So maybe that's a good thing. And then you have another opportunity to end Saul's life in chapter 26 that David foregoes. And Saul says he's going to stop trying to kill him, but he doesn't. And then you have chapters 27 and 29 where David joins up with the Philistines and he secretly fights for Israel while pretending to be allied with the Philistines. And yet things still don't improve. And then finally you come to chapter 31. Then comes this situation in Ziklag. And here things don't get any better. This is not where things improve. This is where things get even worse. If David thought that he had reached rock bottom before, he didn't know what rock bottom was. Because this is what happens when it comes to Ziklag. It's 1 Samuel 30 and verse 1. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and all the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. We don't read the story of David the way we ought to. At least not this story of David like we ought to. We read this story in 1 Samuel 30 kind of removed from everything else, right? This is just something that happened before David was king, but it's not. This is the last installment of a very sad series of episodes in the life of David. He makes good choice after 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 good choice through all of these events in his life. And yet at the end of it, it all looks like the rug is pulled out from under him and he loses everything. It's no wonder at all, that they would weep until they no longer had the strength to weep any longer. How would you respond to a moment like that? What thoughts are going through your head? I see people shaking their head, which means you're thinking something. You're just not saying it out loud. Just give up. All right, I'm done. I've done this for too long. I'm just done trying. You ever felt that way as a Christian? Done. I give up. Felt that way with your kids, felt that way in your marriage, felt that way with your job, felt that way with overcoming that personal sin in your life. I'm done. I give up. What else? What's going through your mind?
God tells us to pray. And obviously, we're closer to God. And while we're praying, and none of this seems to be happening, we get frustrated and we say, well, then forget it, God. I'm tired of praying. You don't listen to me. You don't care about me. I'm done.
Yeah.
And that's when we really get a rock bottom.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Which is, I wrote down on my notes, we might be tempted to react like Job's wife, right? You know what? Forget it. Curse God and die. I give up. I'm just going to go find my happiness. I'm going to try to do something elsewhere because things aren't working with God. What else? What do you feel in this moment? What are you thinking in this moment? Any thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that was going through my mind is how I think that I am very optimistic. So when I get into those
That's right. That's right. Well, and that's the right response, isn't it? That's the right response. I want you to read on in this story. Read on and listen to what it says in verses 5 and 6. It said, "Now David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the widow of Nabal, Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed, because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." And so you read on and you read that things are even worse. Not only has David been treated so unfairly and things have just not been breaking his way, but you see that the people are ready to turn against him too. They're ready to stone David because David's been their leader and David has brought them to this point. And after all, David's the one who fostered the connection with the Philistines, and they were in Ziklag because the Philistines had given it to David, and the Amalekites attacked Ziklag because they were connected to the Philistines, and they wanted to attack the Philistines. And so all of these people lay all of this blame on David. Not only are the bad things happening, but everybody's turning against him. And I'm sure all of us have felt that before as well. But then we read that passage in verse 6, that David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And what you see in that is you see David showing true bravery, true courage. Verse 7, "Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, 'Please bring me the ephod.' So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And David inquired of the Lord, saying, 'Shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them?' And he said to him, 'Pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all.'" Let me tell you, when you read that, what impresses you about that moment? Oh, sorry. Why does that impress you? Why does it impress you that he trusts in God?
Faith is kind of a rare thing to have in that time, actually.
Yeah. And
If you had strong faith, God says you will, so we're going to go out.
that's exactly right. You're impressed that he shows faith because faith is uncommon and it's uncanny. Obviously, the previous King Saul, he didn't have any faith at all.
Yeah.
Why would it be especially hard for David to show faith or have faith in this moment? Yes, sir.
Like we saw with Goliath earlier today, we see that this is people around him. He makes the decision, in this case, where they wanted to stone him. They're going to theater next more than just saying, "Hey, I disagree with you. This was a bad plan."
Yeah. Yeah. They're embittered against him. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, sir, Mr. JD.
Yeah, the impulse, right, if my wife and kids were taken, I'm just going to go get them. That's what I'm going to do. I'm sure that's what he would do as well. But he stops to pray. He stops to ask. And his faith and his prayer made him not impulsive.
Yeah.
Because is this God's will? Is it not God's will? I'm going to stop and pray and still have communication with my God. That's very impressive to me.
So you brought out something there that I didn't realize when I was reading this story and studying for this lesson. The fact that David asked for God's opinion on this, what does that show you about David? He still has faith in God. It shows you that what would he have done if God had said no? He would have listened. He would have listened. He would have done what God told him to do, even if it didn't make any sense. I mean, if I'm David, I'm pretty happy when God says, yeah, go get him, right? But the fact that he asks shows that he is willing to sit back and wait if God says, wait. That's remarkable to me. Yes, ma'am.
It says further in the passage, but I think another show of faith is the fact that he originally went with 600 men, but 200 were too sick to go, and he still carried on.
Yeah. Yeah, he only had 66% of his people, right? And he still continued on to go overtake them. I'm impressed by David's faith, especially because at the end of the day, David could have very easily looked at what he had experienced and said, why should I have faith in God anymore? What's he been doing for me lately? Why should I have faith in God? Why should I believe that I should pray to him? Why should I strengthen myself in him? What has he done for me lately? And so the fact that after all of this, all of these good choices, when things keep going wrong, he still trusts in God, it says something remarkable about the faith of David. Yes, sir, Mr. Garth.
David realized that we own nothing in this world. And his wife and children, as much as he loved them, he loved God more than them. So he appealed to him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if it was God's will, he had the faith that he would be able to recover them. Read on with me. Let's read the rest of the story, unless somebody else wanted to say something. All right. I couldn't get you to talk. Now I can't get you to stop. Anyway. Verse 9. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Bezor, where those left behind remained. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 were too exhausted to cross the brook Bezor, remained behind. Now they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink. And they gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate. Then his spirit revived. For he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" And he said, "I am a young man of Egypt, a servant of an Amalekite." And my master left me behind when I fell sick 3 days ago. We made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites, and on that which belongs to Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. Then David said to him, "Will you bring me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me, or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band." And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David slaughtered them from the twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives. But nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. So David had captured all the sheep and the cattle, which the people drove ahead of the other livestock, and they said, "This is David's spoil." And so at the end of the day, everything turns out and they get everyone back. The cool thing about this story is that it doesn't really stop there. But before this story, we read in chapters 27 through 29, David is actually intending, before all of this happens, to go out to battle with the Philistines against Saul. And the Philistines get a little angsty about David. They're not sure if he's going to turn against them in the battle and stab them in the back. So they send David and his men away to go home. And that's when they discover that Ziklag has been destroyed by fire. But that battle that they're fighting against the Philistines is actually the battle where Saul and Jonathan and his sons end up dying. And so in this moment, when he receives all the people from Ziklag, it's actually the moment where everything really does turn around. When finally Saul is dead and David, the anointed one, the true king, the man who's really after God's own heart, now he can ascend the throne, now he can take power. Now things begin to turn around in the life of David. And so it really is a wonderful story about how David holds on and how David has courage even in the face of distress. And I think we ought to appreciate that does take some courage. Yes, it takes courage to stand up to a giant and to go with him with a sling and stone when he's got an armor bearer, which isn't fair, and a sword and all that stuff, and he's so much bigger. Yeah, that takes courage. But you know what else takes courage? Is continuing on the path of righteousness when it feels like it's not working out. It takes courage to look at your life and say, I have been trying so hard and I have sacrificed so much and I am not getting what I expected to get out of this. Things are not working the way they're supposed to be worked, but you know what? I'm going to keep on this path because I have faith that it's right. That takes a tremendous amount of courage. So I want to show you a couple things that this teaches us about having courage in distressing times. First of all, I want you to appreciate that this story teaches us that courage does not always guarantee immediate success. That's what we see in David and Goliath. But in what happens after Goliath, we learn that sometimes even when you're courageous, you have to wait in order for God to bless you. You think of some other Bible examples. of how courage does not grant immediate success. Who else does that happen to in the Bible? Yes, ma'am. Joseph would be an obvious example. Surprisingly, he's third on my list. But yes, he actually should be first. He is in Genesis after all. But yes, Joseph, right? So long he waited, and so long he was persecuted until finally everything works out for him in the end. Who else did that happen to? Someone says Abraham? In what way? That's right. And at some points trying to help God out a little bit when he shouldn't have been, but he's waiting a long time, right? Until eventually God has everything work out for him. But how hard must it have been to wait and wait and wait and wait? Where else do we see that? Yeah, we see that in Job as well. We see that in Job, where at the end of his story, finally God restores everything and more after everything he had suffered. We see that in the story of Elijah, don't we? When he runs to Mount Horeb and he requests that he might die. And then eventually things turn around for him. We see that in the story of Daniel, who is taken captive and is thrown into the lion's den because he's been praying when he shouldn't have been praying. But eventually, at the end of the day, things work out all right for him. The Bible teaches us that having courage doesn't always guarantee immediate success. In the story of Joseph, he stands up to Potiphar's wife, ends up in prison. The story of Daniel, he stands up for God and prays, he ends up in the lion's den. The story of Elijah, he stands up to Ahab and he ends up getting chased all over the country. But eventually, their courage wins out and things work out in the end. Notice this, secondly, that courage involves waiting on God. And this is something that we don't like about courage. We really, really don't like it. We like the David and Goliath moments where I stand up and I tell my boss, no, I'm not going to make that compromise. I'm not going to cut that corner. I'm not going to make that mistake. I'm not going to commit that sin. And then he promotes you instead of firing you. Like, right? We love that stuff, right? Yeah, I stood up, but we don't like when courage involves waiting on God, where I get fired and I'm jobless for 6 months and I have that angst about whether or not I'm going to be able to provide for my family or not, whether or not I'm ever going to find another job, whether or not I'm going to have to move. And then finally God comes through for me. We don't like the waiting on God. And I think all of us would admit that it'd be much easier to be courageous if courage never involved waiting. But it does. It does. And notice this, that having true courage for that reason, it relies not on what happens immediately, not on what happens instantly, but on the end result. That if we're really going to be courageous, if we're going to find the strength to be courageous, then we have to be thinking about the end and not the immediate. Let me ask you a question. Why does God make us wait sometimes, even though we're showing courage? So that we'll have more faith, right? That is exactly what it does. When God takes us through the distressing times and we have to look fear straight in the face and still rely on Him, that builds our faith. It really does. Why else? Why does He make us wait? Trust. Why so? How so?
We've got to learn to trust in God. We've got to learn we're not in control. And that's very hard. I know it's hard for me because I like to be in control. And we've got to rely on God and trust that God's in control. It may not happen in my time. It's going to happen in God's time. But trust that God will, all things will work together for good.
That's exactly right. Helps us trust in God when He makes us wait. What else? Yes, ma'am.
He's disciplining. So, he's not going to just give it to you. You're learning from that.
It's discipline, right? The trial of waiting, it purifies us. It makes us stronger. It makes us better. Absolutely. Why else? Why does God make us wait? Any other thoughts? Oh, hold on. You're closest. You first.
Who God is, He said, be still and know that I am the Lord. I will be exalted among the heathen.
Yeah, that's right. Teaches us to be still. Teaches us to wait on God. Yes, sir, Mr. Renee? Teaches patience, which is something that we need. If you never had to wait for anything, then you'd never understand what it means to be patient. which is, no, I'm not going to say that. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, teaches us not to be anxious. Paul told Philippians, we're not to worry about anything in life. You know, when you be anxious for an event that takes place, in other words, you're doubting God. Being anxious is what we should be worried about.
That's right. That's right. It not only teaches us to hang on, but it teaches us not to fret while we are hanging on. It teaches us to have that coolness and calmness of spirit. There's a great quote from a man named Tim Keller, who, by the way, I do not endorse nearly any of what he says, but this is a great quote. He says, God gives us exactly what we would have asked for if we knew everything that he knows. That's how we find courage to wait. That's why he makes us wait sometimes, because he knows what's good for us. He knows what's best for us. He knows better than us sometimes whether or not we need to wait, whether or not we need to be purified, whether or not we need to learn patience, whether or not we need to learn how to not be anxious. He teaches us that God gives us exactly what we would ask for if we knew what he knows. And that's what we need to remember when we're struggling to hang on in those trying times. And so, if you had a time machine and you could go back tonight to Ziklag when David and his men come and realize everything has been taken and their city's been burned down, and I could plop you down right next to David in that moment when everybody is weeping until they don't have strength to weep anymore, what word are you going to whisper in his ear? What are you going to tell him? Trust in God? What else? What else? Have faith. Don't give up. Don't stop trying. You're almost there. You'll get there eventually. Just wait till you see what happens next. Right? And I imagine that if he looked at what's going on in your life and the struggles that you had, that he'd say exactly the same thing to you if he knew what was coming next. Don't give up. Don't stop. Keep walking. Just wait until you see what happens next. That's bravery. And that's what David would tell us. I am out of time. I got you out a minute early. How about that? So we will, in just a second, we'll have a song, and then we'll do an invitation, and then we'll be dismissed. Thank you guys so much for class tonight. I appreciate it.